This is an Irish independent podcast.
We're in Dubai. It's a week ago, February 18th, 2025 to be exact, and this is a tennis match between Emma Raducanu and Karolina Muchova. It's the Dubai Tennis Championship. It is very off-Broadway. It's a Tuesday. It's in the round of 32. It's not even in a stadium as such. There are no fans seated to the sides of the court. Instead, fences split Raducanu and Muchova's court from other courts right beside them, where other round of 32 matches are happening. It's a day to either win your match and quickly move on, or to lose and get on a plane. Muchova wins the first two games. There's nothing untoward happening. But then we see Raducanu is upset. She walks over to the umpire.
And let's hope that Raducanu isn't in trouble here. You always worry when she goes to the umpire's chair. It may be because it's a little bit wet out there behind the baseline.
The first assumption looking on is injury, but she's very upset for just an injury. There's also a lot of dialogue with the umpire. If it were injury, the conversation would be short. I'm injured. We only see Raducanu from behind, but her shoulders are heaving, and it suggests someone who's extremely upset about something.
Well, unfortunately, we cannot hear what is going on, but it doesn't look good, does it, for Raducanu? Appears to be in tears here. And this is very, very concerning.
It becomes very clear to everyone that this is not a routine retirement when Raducanu moves behind the umpire's chair. In effect, she's hiding.
Something has happened, and I'm not sure what it is.
Muchova then walks over to speak with the umpire. They exchange a few quick words, and then Muchova walks behind the umpire chair to Raducanu.
But Karolina Muchova, one of the goodies on the WTA Tour, just consoling her opponent. Is it an injury? Is it illness? Unfortunately, no mics down there. Maybe that's a good thing in this situation.
Raducanu eventually takes her seat, but she's visibly upset, and we see her wiping away tears with a towel.
And you never want to see a player in tears on court. This is meant to be a fun game. A lot at stake, of course.
And then, just like that, the match resumes. Raducanu walks back out for game 3.
It looks like Raducanu's found a way to continue, and you can hear the crowd appreciate that. Try and get to the bottom of what happened.
The rest of the match passes without incident. As expected, Muchova is too strong for Raducanu and wins in straight sets. The curiosity around her upset, though, is soon explained by the Women's Tennis Association, who release a statement. They say the day before her match against Muchova, Raducanu was approached by a man. The statement uses typical sanitised statement language in describing the approach. It says the man, quote, exhibited fixated behaviour. What exactly fixated behaviour is, we don't know. But it was enough that when Emma Raducanu saw him the next day, sitting in the first few rows of her match, she was deeply upset and concerned. We're also told the man was ejected, and he's been banned from all WTA events until a threat assessment is carried out. That was Tuesday. On the Thursday, we're told Raducanu chose to drop any charges against the man. He's a tourist, not a Dubai local. The man has agreed to maintain his distance. On Instagram, Raducanu said it was a difficult experience and thanked fans for their support. The thing is, this has not been her first difficult experience, as she calls it, with a stranger. Jump back 3 years. Raducanu was 19 years old, but she's already a star. As an 18-year-old, she shocked the world to win the US Open as a qualifier, winning $2.5 million in the process. And it meant instant stardom in the US, at home and globally. Those 3 weeks in New York 2021 were surreal.
You started this journey 3 weeks ago. You're the first qualifier to ever win a major tournament. How did you do it?
First of all, I really want to congratulate Layla and her team on an incredible fortnight. I mean, she's played some incredible tennis and beaten some of the top players in the world, so it was an incredibly difficult match, but I thought the level was extremely high. And I hope that we play each other in many more tournaments and hopefully finals.
She is wise beyond her years. That was September. By November, she had a stalker. Amrit Magar stalked Emma Raducanu between the 1st of November and the 4th of December in 2021. In his trial the following year, it emerged he had on one occasion walked 23 miles to her home and stolen her father's shoe as a souvenir. He left a map behind on her porch detailing his 23-mile route to her house. At Bromley Magistrates Court, he was handed a 5-year restraining order. The court heard Magger had turned up at her home on 3 different occasions. He loitered outside and he left unwanted gifts and cards. He was eventually arrested when her father Ian spotted him on the doorbell camera on their porch. The court heard this had all left Raducanu, quote, constantly looking over her shoulder. Magger is banned from coming within a mile of her house. So in that context, you can understand 22-year-old Raducanu's upset when another difficult experience, as she called it, happened in Dubai. I want to stress I don't want to conflate different things. Clearly, we don't know much about the incident in Dubai. But it was interesting because, as ever within the online world, there was division, even over something like this. A certain cohort seemed to think Raducanu's reaction in Dubai was OTT. But then it was very noticeable that on any comment section, huge numbers of people straight away responded with one name, Monica Seles. And in some ways, that name ends all arguments. It was striking the extent to which the Monica Seles story, 32 years on, is seared in people's consciousness. Completely shocking and devastating. It's unbelievable, really. And we're going to talk about it all with John Wertheim. John's a brilliant and long-time tennis writer. He knows Monica Seles, he's spoken to her down the years, and he charted her rise and attempted recovery. First, though, a reminder of her career. And a warning if you're of a sensitive disposition, we're about to recall a violent moment. There is audio of the incident, and if there are children listening, then I would say this isn't suitable for their ears. Seles is so seared in people's memory and consciousness for lots of reasons. There is a chance she was the most dominant tennis player we've ever seen. Born in Yugoslavia, she was a prodigy. She went to the fabled Nick Bollettieri School in Florida. And between the ages of 16 and 19, Monica Seles won 8 Grand Slam titles. It was insane. 8 Grand Slams as a teenager between 16 and 19. She was world number 1 for 100 straight weeks. Which brings us to that infamous tournament in Hamburg, April 1993.
40-15.
Seles is involved in a clay court match. Naturally, she's winning against Magdalene Malieva. It's business as usual at a non-Grand Slam event, with bigger days at the French Open on the horizon. We're between games.
Seles führt mit 4-3, 4-3.
Seles is sitting in her chair. A 38-year-old German man, Gunter Parsch, is in the crowd. He slides past 2 security guards. He leans over the rail and plunges a serrated knife into Seles' back. 32 years on, it's horrific to hear the moment. Parsch is quickly apprehended and dragged away.
Bitte sofort einen Arzt auf den Platz.
Initially, Seles, confused, stands up. She reaches to the wound on her upper back. A man in a pink t-shirt and a woman in a dress rush over to her. She sits down. The woman grabs a towel, and more people come over, and Seles eventually lies down on the clay. The camera cuts to show us Parsch being dragged away out of the stadium. We then see Seles sitting up, but she looks at the point of drifting out of consciousness. It's utterly shocking. Her opponent, Malieva, is sitting in her chair with a towel covering her mouth, looking on in horror. We're now at 6 minutes after the stabbing, and a stretcher is rolled onto court. Seles is able to stand up. She's grimacing. The grimace she often played with has taken on far darker connotations now. She's able, though, to sit up on the stretcher and is wheeled off the court. Seles is 19 years old, at the peak of her powers. Maybe not even close to the peak yet, only coming into it. Thankfully, no organs or arteries are hit. The injury is not life-threatening. Indeed, it only took her several weeks to physically heal. But Monica Seles would never come close to being the same tennis player again. Indeed, she wouldn't play tennis for another 2 years. Her era was over. Let's talk to John Wertheim. John Wertheim is with us, happy to say, long time and widely, brilliantly regarded Sports Illustrated tennis writer. John, how good was Monica Seles between the age of 16 and 19?
Monica Seles, if she had kept up her trajectory, and perhaps even not, would have gone down as the greatest tennis player, perhaps in women's tennis history. I mean, as it was, in spite of the tragedy, she's probably one of the 5, 6, 7, 8 best. But I think you look at her numbers and what she accomplished before turning age 20, and she was on track to be the greatest ever, the GOAT.
In one stretch of Grand Slams, she won 8 of 11. What made her so good? I know Chris Everett, who was beaten by a 15-year-old Seles, said she'd never played anybody harder, faster, or louder, for that matter, but harder, faster.
She's such a fascinating character because off the court, she is and was absolutely lovely and conflict averse and non-confrontational. And when she competed, there was this ferocity that you just can't teach. And she took the ball very early. I mean, the way she took time away from her opponents, the precision, the power off both flanks. But she had this competitive drive that was just extraordinary. I mean, she was a superior competitor to Steffi Graf, who's sort of seen as the great sort of tennis's Iron Maiden. And yet, as soon as the match would stop, Monica Seles would turn into this giggling teenager, which was much more in keeping with her personality. It was really a very strange transformation, but she was just an absolutely ferocious competitor.
The footage and sounds from Hamburg are, even 32 years on, even when you know it wasn't a fatal attack, they remain visceral and disturbing. Here is a clip of Seles speaking in 2008 about that day.
I was just sitting down and leaning forward, and then that's when I suddenly just said, I felt a sharp pain in my back, and I looked back and I saw a person, having his hand and a knife, and then, oh my, this guy put a knife in my back. It's chaos. I don't know what's happening. I see security guards holding a person down.
The person, Gunter Parsch, he was acting to preserve the honour and career of Steffi Graf.
Yeah, I mean, there's a mental health component to the story, but this was a super fan of Steffi Graf who believed he was, as you say, sort of protecting her supremacy, Steffi Graf's supremacy, by taking out her great rival. Where were you on that day? How did you first hear about it? What are your memories of it? Oh man, I was in college at the time, and it was extraordinary. I mean, even days and days later, this I believe was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. I mean, this was international news. This was horrifying, and I think some of it was just the real world material implication. I mean, here was the dominant tennis player in the world who was about to, the next decade of tennis stardom awaited her, and suddenly she was, injured and incapacitated. But I also think this was a real sort of breach of the social contract of sports. And I think that was part of the story as well, that we think about fans being passionate, and we think about this is obviously predates social media and all the vitriol and the problems that come with that. But I think, this was really sort of a change in the fan-athlete dynamic. And it was jarring. It was really shocking. Doctors who treated her said afterwards she was lucky that if she hadn't been leaning over to take a sip of water at that moment, then there's the possibility, I don't know what percentage terms, but the possibility she might have been paralysed. But thankfully, knife missed the spine and missed any vital organs. What's extraordinary is the leniency of the German courts afterwards. I mean, they heavily took into account the mental health component, but no jail time, just a suspended sentence, probation. Yeah, and that did not help Monica Seles. I mean, part of this is the story about physical rehab, but I think she'll tell you now a lot of this is just the mental health aspect of this. And yeah, the fact that the German courts, I don't have it in front of it, but they sort of likened this deranged individual to a pathetic lamb. There was real, you could say compassion, and you could also say really irrational lenience. But yeah, the fact that this man who ended his career, who very nearly could have really seriously injured Monica Seles, that he faced no jail time, I think that compounded some of her mental health injuries. Yes, and he seemed to testify that he wasn't trying to kill her just to maim her, to allow Steffi Graf reascend. So tell us about the psychological fallout then for Monica Seles. The physical recovery was relatively straightforward, although some back pain persevered for a time. But psychologically, what did this do to a 19-year-old? She has been real. I mean, again, this is one of the real treasures of sports. I mean, this is just a delightful human being, which adds another layer of tragedy to this. But she's very open about it. She says, "Look, I would be walking and hear a balloon pop, or I would be sitting there at a changeover when I got back to playing tennis, and I would keep looking over my shoulder." And you go through an experience like this, and even with a lot of therapy, it's very hard to put this out of her head. And she was never, I mean, she did win, no more majors, and she sort of, at some level, she got her career back, but she was never the player she was before this incident. But this was a life-changing event for her. And yeah, I mean, you can imagine, you go through trauma like this as a young player, completely, this was completely unanticipated. This is not something, it's not as though the WTA warns you about this, certainly not in the early 90s. Just this complete startling event. And, I think she would tell you that to this day, there is still some mental scar tissue there.
And were things enlightened enough in 1993 into 4 and 5 that she went to therapy and tried to talk it through, or was it a route of suppression and try and kick the bad thoughts away?
I think, to her credit, she was from the start very open that the physical wound on her backside, that was only part of the rehabilitation she had to do. I mean, sort of there were a number of microaggressions along the way that other players did not vote for her to retain her ranking. There were a lot of, she had some adversity subsequent. Her father passed away. But yeah, she was always from the start has been very upfront about sort of the mental, psychological price that this exacted.
And she retreated, it seems, as well. Like Chris Everett tells a story of a chance meeting with Seles at Miami Airport in 1995. Again, the stabbing happened in 93. At this stage, Seles was thinking about coming back. But when Seles saw Everett, she hid at the back of the plane. And Everett sort of said, I know you're there. So that will give a sense of how she was feeling about the world.
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind, too, this is before tennis players traveled with teams and entourages as they do today. So it's entirely possible that Monica Seles would have been traveling by herself. And this was real trauma. And seeing someone like, I mean, I know Chris Everett has told that story, and I think, Chris Everett, another force of good, but I think there were a number of triggers, and seeing people from, former colleagues or people that for whatever reason would have reminded you of that traumatic day in Hamburg. It's sort of easy to see how that could be triggering.
Well, I don't see how she doesn't see a tennis court at that stage and not think of it.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
You mentioned her ranking. So she is the dominant player, has had 100 weeks at world number 1. She's a phenomenon. The WTA makes a suggestion that we should freeze Seles's world number ranking. This is the world number 1 ranking. This is not an ordinary injury, so let's freeze it. She stays as the world number 1 until she's ready to return. And a vote was held at a tournament in Rome in 93. 16 of the 17 top players shot that right down. No chance.
Uncharitably, that is a window into the sort of self-focus and the narcissism one needs to be a successful tennis player. I think, if you wanted to give those players a bit more grace, you would say this was so extraordinary, unprecedented in tennis. And the WTA, bear in mind, is sort of this strange partnership of players and tournaments. So in theory, the players have 50% say. And yeah, I know that's something that really stung Monica Seles. I do wonder if part of that is this is just so extraordinary and so unprecedented. Players didn't quite grasp that this wasn't a knee injury or a case of the flu that was sidelining one of their peers.
Yeah. You mentioned like this kind of, no pun intended, this kind of rupturing of the social contract between athletes and fans who get to sit so close to them. I'm sure the tennis world was completely spooked, female athletes in particular, perhaps. And I know at Wimbledon that year, the year of the stabbing, instead of sitting with their backs to the crowd, they sat with their backs to the umpire, so they could almost have a kind of 360 to an extent of the crowd. So this obviously had an effect on tour as well.
I think this is one of the issues that makes tennis perhaps particularly vulnerable, which is this is not like football, like soccer, where players are on teams, and whether it's the configuration of the arena or just the security of these buildings, these tennis players are individuals. They travel the world, and you can see even that Hamburg match, if you go back and look, it's not as though the crowds were filled. So on the one hand, you have these athletes who are internationally known. I mean, if you took a poll of the 20 most famous female athletes right now, I'd bet half to 2/3 of them would be tennis players. So these are global recognized athletes. And yet when they perform, they're not playing at Wembley Stadium. I mean, they're not playing at Madison Square Garden here in New York. There's sometimes it's a Tuesday afternoon in Hamburg, Germany, or in Doha, and there are only a couple hundred fans in the venue. So it's a sort of strange mix of these massive stars, and yet when they compete, there's very little infrastructure. There could be 200 people watching even some of the biggest stars in women's tennis just because of scheduling and the way the sport is set out. It's a really bad combination. And yeah, this is happening. We talk about Monica Seles, but there have been a number of instances, lesser publicized and happily less serious consequences. But if you talk to most players, they will tell you that they've had an incident, they've had to report someone. Martina Hingis had, I remember covering an event maybe 20 years ago in Miami, and they arrested someone on spot. Well, what did he do? Oh, he's been following Martina Hingis around the world. So this is not, this did not disappear with Monica Seles, and social media has probably only made it worse.
As you referenced, during her 2 or 27 months to be exact, years away from the court, her father is diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. And again, we're talking about a kid here. She's 19. You can kind of think she's older, but this is her father dying. So it's just a horrific crisis in her life. And she develops a very unhealthy relationship with food. And on tour, she says herself, she ended up being maybe 37 pounds overweight. She couldn't control it. Here she is looking incredibly healthy and fit, by the way, in 2008, around the time of her autobiography. And she's talking about her problems with binge eating.
I think my eating issues definitely started after my stabbing, and they were magnified after my father was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and then probably the points of the pressures of the job, figuring out my own identity, and I think learning to let go of things. For some other reason, I felt weird that I couldn't control a simple thing like eating, and I was so in control when you'd watch me on the tennis court, but yet what I put in my mouth, I had zero control, and I was kind of embarrassed by it because everybody viewed me as a super strong mentally athlete. So because of that, I probably kept it, much more hidden than looking back at it now. I would have maybe done a few things differently.
Like any addiction, John, there was a kind of a payoff, I suppose, and she said it made me feel better briefly. It was numbing myself to the pain to just gorge on food, but then you would feel physically and mentally terrible, and then you would self-loathe, and then the cycle would start again. And she was trapped in that, which sounds utterly grim as well.
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind, this is 25, 30 years ago. We had much different attitudes about therapy and about mental well-being and being good to yourself. We did not have the vocabulary. We also just practically didn't have the infrastructure. And again, she's very open. It's funny because I remember now she tells a story of sort of, peanut butter stuffed pretzels were her downfall, and she sort of ticks off the various snacks that she would go to. But at the time, clearly she was coping with this trauma in ways that weren't always particularly healthy. And again, I think she's really a fascinating character, and I cannot understate how much sort of affection and admiration I have for her. She's just one of these people it's impossible not to like. But the fact that she had this personality where she did not want to be famous, she did not want the trappings that came with being a star. She always describes herself to this day, I think, as a pleaser. She doesn't want confrontation. She's just an absolutely lovely person. Then for those 45 minutes of a tennis match, she was able to completely transform into someone. I think that whole dynamic may have contributed a bit to this. But yeah, I mean, she's very outspoken. I mean, this is not me projecting and playing armchair therapist. I mean, this is her words that for many, many years she struggled with how to cope with this trauma. And it's understandable. I mean, I think also we think now, a 19-year-old tennis player would be this phenom. She won 8 majors before she turned 20 years old. So I think we also need to remember how young, at what point in her life, where she was in her life when she had this traumatic event.
Yes, completely. And like plucked from Tito's Yugoslavia to Nick Bollettieri to superstardom in double quick time. So the comeback is 27 months on from Hamburg. And there's a degree of a false dawn to it because she wins her first tournament, the Canadian Open in 95. But then she wins the Australian Open in 96. And everybody would have been forgiven for thinking, wow, Seles, business as usual. But that was as good as it got. She Reached the US Open final that same year in 96 and the French Open final in 98. And that would be it. And in a piece you'd written, you made the point that by the year 2000, when Martina Hingis beat her 6-love, kind of unthinkable, really, it was done. It just wasn't going to happen between the weight issues and whatever else was going on. She just wasn't the force, allied to bigger, stronger players like the Williamses coming on board.
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind at the time, and tennis players' window was much more compressed than it is now. By your late 20s, you were really sort of in your autumn years. So she misses those prime years. She does win one more major, but she never sort of regained her toehold against Steffi Graf. I mean, it's easy to think of another athlete saying, "Oh, I was stabbed in your name, and now I'm going to redouble my efforts to sort of prevail in this rivalry." That's not how Monica Seles was wired. Her dominance over Steffi Graf was no longer. And yeah, by the time she had reached her mid to late 20s, we had this generation, whether it was Martina Hingis, who was much younger and was sort of crafty and clever and could take advantage of Monica Seles, some of the movement issues that came with her perhaps not being in peak physical condition, or the Williams sisters, Lindsay Davenport, Jennifer Capriati, who were just younger, playing with better technology and more powerful players. The window closed fairly quickly. I mean, this is one of the great champions of tennis. She should rest on her laurels. And by age 16, she had the credentials for the Hall of Fame. And yet, at the same time, this is really a great tennis tragedy, a great sports tragedy. I mean, the trajectory was she was going to be the greatest ever, and that obviously, came to a halt in the most horrific way.
Graf would win 11 Grand Slams after the stabbing, but Graf was quoted as saying before the stabbing, "Even at my best, I just couldn't beat her."
Yeah, and I think that's another element to that. I mean, what you're describing here, there's really something. It's classic, it's biblical, and I think part of this too is that Steffi Graf, a very introverted and shy, and her reaction to this, I think, is another dimension to this. It's sort of the Hollywood ending would say these two great rivals were able to come together over this horrific event. That's not what happened. I think I'm not speaking out of turn to say to this day, there's probably a bit of a chill between the two of them. I think Steffi Graf never quite knew how to respond to this. And yeah, I mean, Steffi Graf's career really was revived. I mean, it's whether correlation does not mean causation. I mean, who knows how this would have played out otherwise, but post stabbing, I mean, sadly, another element to this, this deranged, this lunatic with a knife in his hand essentially got what he wanted. I mean, Steffi Graf's career was preserved and her legacy was preserved, and Monica Seles' trajectory was very different. So one of the additional elements of tragedy is this madman sort of got what he wanted, as deranged as that might have been.
No, it's true. In the most dark, perverse way, it's the most perfectly executed plan. I mean, he couldn't have done a better job if that was his aim. As dark a thought as it is. An aspect which you touched on in a piece in The Guardian a number of years ago to Seles is, on her return, she was massively popular, without winning, without being the same player. And popular in a strange kind of way. Like you write about her being almost a proxy for people's sadness or grief. You talk about how when you were talking to her at one kind of rinky-dink tournament in Oklahoma, a woman interrupted you and clasped Seles' hand and said, "I know what you're going through because my husband Eddie has cancer." Somebody else, I think, brought their brother's ashes. He died in a motorcycle accident to her match, and people approached her, wanted to, ironically, given what a stranger had done to her, wanted to touch her and wanted to commiserate with her or to exchange their sadness with her. It was a remarkable thing which kind of happened.
Again, I stress her age as well. I mean, imagine going through this in your early 20s. But no, she sort of became this vessel. She sort of became this symbol for people who had loss or adversity, tragedy in their lives. But imagine that too. I mean, you're this towering champion of your sport. I mean, again, this is someone on pace to be the best ever, right? I mean, this is, pick your athlete in Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. I mean, that's sort of the class we're talking about. And then suddenly you retain your popularity, but it's not for your excellence. It's not for winning titles. It's because you've engendered all of this sympathy and compassion, and people aren't coming to see you play because of the way you hit a tennis ball, but it's because they identify with you because their husband died of cancer or their brother was in a motorcycle accident. I mean, imagine sort of the transformation and your sense of self and what a strange dynamic you have. And the other thing too, I noticed, and she was so good about this, but she had this horrific encounter with a fan. And as a result of that, she only became sort of more relatable to other fans. So she had more fan encounters after this horrible stabbing than she did before when she was winning titles left and right. So in a strange way, sort of this only gave her more fan engagement when it was an initial fan engagement to sort of put her in this position to begin with.
And she embraced it. She was more approachable than she had any expectation to be.
I think part of that is her nature. That as she always says, I'm a people pleaser. She just didn't have it in her to blow people off. But I also think that she realized, okay, maybe I'm not ranked number one. Maybe I'm not going to go down as Martina Navratilova and Chris Evert now. But I can still have this relevance and this connection with so many other people. And I don't know if she embraced it in the sense that she sought it out, but she was very courteous and very giving of her time when people came up to her, as they did day in, day out, with their own stories of trauma.
In her last competitive year, she did reach the quarterfinals of all 4 Grand Slams. So it was not like a kind of a withering exit, but it was an exit, and it was a career of what could have been, unfortunately. She's 51 years of age now. You're at several points here, you're talking about her with remarkable fondness. Is she in a good place at 51?
Yeah, she's in a good place. I saw her a few months ago, and she lives in Florida. She still quite private. But she seems to be doing great. She's just lovely to talk to. She comes to the U.S. Open and does some events with fans. Still follows the sport. I'm trying to get her to be a commentator because she still has a real sort of eye for tennis. Yeah, I mean, again, there's so many dimensions to this, but one of them is this has not this has not diminished her sort of essential goodness. She's just an extraordinary person.
Okay. Family?
I know she's, by some reports married, by some reports it's merely a committed, not merely, but some reports like a committed relationship, no children, lives in Florida, seems quite happy.
Our jumping off point was Emma Raducanu. That's like, the newsy hook, I suppose. And I had made the point at the top of the piece, I didn't want to correlate two things which are different. I don't know what's gone on here with Raducanu. But it was noteworthy that in the comment sections where some people had said, well, is her reaction a bit over the top? The name Monica Seles just again and again and again, it was seared in people's consciousness. So, for Raducanu, she's already had one stalker experience, and that went through the courts in 2022. And now this Dubai incident. And I suppose what's kind of worrying for her is that her coach, Roman Kelicic, he was her former coach, but he was working with her in Abu Dhabi earlier this month. He made the point, speaking to his local Czech Republic media, that this wasn't just man saw her on the Monday, turned up at the match Tuesday. He said, this man has followed her to Singapore, to Abu Dhabi, where I was with her, to Doha. Now in Dubai, we noticed him. There was only one moment in the whole month where I, the fitness coach, the security guard who was with us, were not with her. So that man was assessing the situation and looking for the best moment to get close to her. He had a strategy that was terrifying. He thought everything through. He calculated it. It's terrifying how much he, in essence, thought about it all and planned it all. His strategy worked, and it was to get closer to her. That's what he says about the Monday where he approached her. And again, we've no details about what happened on Monday beyond fixated behaviour, as per the WTA statement. Raducanu arrived back to Heathrow Airport where she met her father, and she's in tears again. So it's really awful what I guess predominantly female sports people have to go through here.
Yeah, and I do think I do think this is quite gendered for any number of reasons. You don't hear. I mean, you know, in the WNBA, Caitlin Clark had an episode as well a few months ago. You did not hear about this with male athletes, certainly not at this level or at this frequency. I do think the fact that Emma Raducanu not only already had a stalking incident, but if you go back and read the story, I mean, the guy walked, I think he was 20 some odd miles to her home and took a souvenir, took one of her father's shoes, I believe. That is a certain type of behavior that sort of shows you the lack of reason and rationality here. And I think tennis is sort of particularly problematic as a sport, just logistically. I mean, part of this is, what do all sports want? They want engagement. They want passion. I realize there are, we need to use legal terms, but fixated behavior doesn't sound altogether different from what all sports franchises want their fans to exhibit. So I think you're in an industry when fan engagement and fans connecting with athletes is part of the business model. This obviously crosses a huge line. I do think that tennis's nature is part of the problem as well. I mean, I don't know if you saw the clip of Raducanu when she played the Muhova match and basically took shelter behind the umpire's chair, but you could count the number of fans in the stands on a few hands. So Emma Raducanu is this global superstar and makes tens of millions of dollars in endorsements, but when she competes, she's often in these tiny venues doesn't have the security, and she doesn't have sort of the apparatus that Caitlin Clark would have when there are 20,000 people in an arena. I just, Monica Seles is sort of the specter, the great stain that is not clearly completely faded on women's tennis to begin with. But I do wonder the fact that Emma Raducanu not only had a previous stalking incident, but got to see firsthand the literally insane lengths that these perpetrators will go to. I wonder if that isn't part of what was at play here as well. I don't know how anyone could say overreaction. That seems like the kind of, trollish behavior that makes social media the cesspool it is. I don't know how you have anything other than compassion for her.
What have been your impressions of Raducanu since she burst on the scene, obviously as 18-year-old US Open winner? It's been difficult for her on the court to reach those heights again. But in general terms, how is she finding her life turning into kind of global superstardom?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point you raised, that this is not somebody who was projected for great stardom. I mean, a few months before she won the US Open, the tournament before the US Open, she was playing in Landisdown, Pennsylvania, in basically a public park. A few months before the US Open, there were still college coaches in the US hoping she would play college tennis. That is a really sudden transformation. And overall, I think she's handled it with quite a bit of grace. I mean, you can imagine, you can imagine in a happy way how cataclysmic this must have been. And the fact that she's, the sort of multinational player who was young and very much of the moment with this sort of globalized world we live in, it was obviously very attractive for advertisers. So you had that whole dimension of suddenly she has unimaginable wealth, literally overnight. The tennis results have not kept pace. I mean, obviously she has not sort of replicated the great success she had at the US Open. But it almost doesn't matter. I mean, I think she's handled herself quite well. She's still quite young. And I think it's very easy to go on Twitter and bash athletes and figures you don't particularly like. You take a step back and you sort of map this out, and at that age, for her to have had this transformative moment, I think she's dealt with it all quite well, and she's still quite young.
John Wertheim of Sports Illustrated. That was great, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.